but they frequently testify in front of Congress on particular issues. Some of them form advocacy groups. Biologists who study a particular organism are frequently involved in advocating for protecting the environments in which these organisms live. So we do already, at least among scientists, recognize some legitimate advocacy. Reporting also is very much supposed to be impartial. However, it's also supposed to be accurate. And none of science happens in a vacuum. Some of the context for science is decidedly political. If you want people to understand how scientific findings affect them, they're going to need to know how it affects their real lives. Sometimes that means that you're telling them that these findings have some implications for, say, bills that are before Congress. They have some implications for various policies. They have implications for all sorts of things. And sometimes being accurate, as David Dobbs pointed out in the last session on the history of science, being accurate means including the political background that some of these findings came out of. Because while science is a tool for stripping bias out of how we view the world, it's not perfect. None of that science happens in a vacuum. So both for scientists and for reporters, we do already recognize some legitimate uses of advocacy. And so what we're going to talk about today is how to balance that, where the lines are, and as John's about to discuss, what some of the drawbacks are.
Okay, so two things I just want to say is, one, if you're communicating science at all, you're being an advocate. You do it because you think it's exciting, you think it's important, you think more people should know what's going on. And so the question is not, do you advocate or not? It's how do you advocate, what do you advocate, and what choices you make. So point number one. Point number two is sort of a doom and gloom view of the world. So there's a lot of research coming out now that shows people assign expertise to anybody doing communicating based on whether they identify with them culturally. So if somebody feels like you're one of them, they're more likely to rate your expertise highly and more likely to believe what you're going to say. The term for that seems to be used in literature is cultural cognition. So you filter what you learn through your cultural background. What Stephanie has seen, I have seen, and hasn't made it into the literature yet, but I'm asking around to find out if somebody's working on it, is the reverse of that. As you report on science, people begin to assign your cultural background to you, or they infer a cultural background. So because I tend to accept the reality of climate change, I've gotten labeled various things. Because I tend to accept the reality of evolution, I've got labeled various other things. People assume I am a liberal atheist for those two topics alone. And therefore, just by writing about science accurately, people will assign you a cultural identity and then use that identity against you. So they will assume you're advocating for something, even if you're just trying to do things accurately. So the question is, if they're not going to believe you, how do we reach this audience with accurate information? And that's where you guys come in. So if you feel you need the mic, raise your hand. I'll run it over to you. And if you just want to yell, go right ahead.
And let me, just before we start, right over to James. How many of you here already consider yourself advocates for one thing or another that you're out there, you're communicating about already? And as long as we have you all here, how many of you have run into what John just described about you report your science and suddenly everybody knows your politics? Yeah.
So if anybody here is actually doing sociological research, you have your target audience for your study. It's not in literature yet.
I've been doing a lot of thinking about this. So my name is James Furnish, and I've been writing about climate on a one of the science blogs called ClassM, and it seems to me that you can't. This is probably going to offend some people, but I really take issue with this whole notion that somehow you can just frame the story to match your audience, and that's going to make everything better. You know, just talk on their terms, use their language, use their cultural, signifiers, that you can reach them and change their mind. And I think what John's talking about, the fact that if you are not actually part of them, if you're just pretending by using these so-called framing techniques, it's not going to work. And I think the evidence in climate change is pretty clear. Despite what some people say, climate change activists have been working for a very long time on these techniques. They've been trying to reach people, evangelicals, for instance. They've been crafting presentations using biblical language, trying to appeal to the sense of morality. It doesn't work. It's been going on for years, and it has not shifted public opinion one bit. So I'm not saying I have any answers on how we can change people's minds on things that they're set on because of cultural identity, but I don't think trying to appeal to them using some sort of spin or framing or cultural trickery is going to work. So that's, again, I don't know the way that will succeed, but I know the way it won't.
So my name is Heather Goldstone, and I'm a reporter at a local NPR affiliate, and I have gotten the question not just from readers, but from my own editors writing about climate change, but also evolution. Aren't you advocating for something? And I guess my reply to them is, yes, I'm advocating for science and science literacy, and trying to represent that science as well as possible. But I think maybe part of the bigger picture besides just reframing individual stories is a scientist said to me a few months ago something that really stuck with me, that the point of science and the point of journalism is not impartiality. Impartialness or impartiality is a tool for trying to reach the best possible understanding of the truth. And that we need to reframe the whole discussion about what is impartial, because really what we're trying to get at is what is the truth. I just thought I would share.
And I'm going to take a moment just because she walked into the room. We have Desiree Shellback here, who in her real life is a union organizer, which is about as advocating as you can get. She's also the host of a radio show called Skeptically Speaking, where it is her job to present things in such a way that people make up their own minds about it. And the point is not just to inform, but also to get people thinking. And I asked her to think a little bit about how what she's doing affects what she does. All right. Well, I try to. The show is objective.
The show is objective. But I am not at all. And so it's tenuous at times. I do find that I invite guests on that speak for the things that I want them to say, that I can't say on it. So I'm very left. So I invite Greg on my show.
But move to the left. Oh. I'm not sure what section is this about. Yeah, and I think that, I guess my contribution is I think that the problem of people who are interested in issues about science are often under the assumption that there isn't a political science to science. And I don't know if Sean Otto's here or not yet, but he has made the point that there is no partisan aspect to science at all, but there is never a scientific discovery that isn't of political focus of some kind. And that's something that people are reporting on and talking about it. I think like we try to ignore it, but they do that at a terrible. They really have to not ignore that aspect of things. So you can be political and science working at the same time.
But the problem is that if you are too overtly political, you're going to chase away people who may disagree with you. So I think it's important to not pretend to be objective, but to at least respond to other people's valid points when they're criticizing you for being inobjective. Does that make sense?
to make people think that you can go there to use it.
I just have a quick corollary to the point about you can't pretend to be part of somebody else's kind of social-cultural group. You can't pretend to be part of that social-cultural group, but you can make a lot of headway on things by not faking it, but by respecting what they have to say. I did a lot of interviews with a nonprofit group in Kansas that did focus groups to find out what people thought about climate and energy. And they kept finding that even the people that thought that climate change was this giant scam and hoax had already done things like change all their light bulbs and bought a Prius and cared about energy for other reasons. So they're not pretending to not care about climate change, but they can say, hey, this is why I care about energy. Here's why you care about energy. But we both want the same things with energy, so let's focus on where we share value, where we share results, even if we don't share the values that lead to those results.
So I would say that's perfectly right if your topic is energy. If
Yes.
your topic is climate change, you're still screwed.
Right, yeah, of course.
Thanks, John. I'm Mark Henderson, and among other things, I've got a book on science and politics called The Geek Manifesto, which is coming out in May in the UK. It hasn't got a US publisher yet, but you will be able to get it from the UK. But the point I wanted to make about advocacy and science here is I think the problems often arise when what is scientific and what is political end up getting mixed up and confused. So take climate change as an example. We should, I think, all be able to agree in this room that actually the science of, the raw science of climate change, that carbon emissions are linked to global warming, is something that is happening, humans are responsible, etc., etc. The problem is it doesn't necessarily follow that the political solution that most scientists and most environmentalists advocate as a result of that is the only solution. And the problem is that because I think the politics and the science have become very confused in that issue, what has happened is people who reject the politics, who reject the political implications of cutting greenhouse gas emissions, suddenly start to attack the science rather than the political solutions. It should be entirely possible to accept the science of climate change and yet to believe that Kyoto and the processes associated with that are wrong and that we should be investing, say, in technological solutions or something else entirely. And actually, I think that that is very often the mistake that gets made when science advocacy happens. It's assumed that because the science says this, then the political solution must be that. Whereas the science may in fact inform a much broader range of political solutions like that. And one has to be actually quite subtle about that point if you're not going to end up with the people who disagree with the politics ending up attacking the science, which I think none of us want.
David Westcott. Just in response to what James, I think, was said up in front, he said he doesn't feel like this should be accomplished through, or could be accomplished through spin or framing. Just a question, how many people in this room have ever developed and implemented a strategic communications campaign?
There's one person behind
I mean, I can tell you, if they're well thought out, they work. I mean, there's a reason why Blackwater changed its name. There's a reason why Republicans keep saying the word Obamacare. You know, framing works. It has worked. It's especially effective when you're on the attack. And so I think the answer is not so much, it doesn't work from framing, but it takes a comprehensive long-term strategy that involves developing messages, testing messages, building alliances with diverse coalition partners. There's a long process that goes on here. There's no one thing that will ever do it. There's no silver bullet. Everybody here knows that. But I when you say this won't work, based on what evidence? This is sort of the question that I have.
Yeah, in one of my checkered past, my black history. I produced an all-night radio phone-in show. So those of you in the States are familiar with coast-to-coast radio. It was kind of the Canadian version of that. And it was on a public broadcaster. And so we had people phoning in at 2 o'clock in the morning who believed that contrails that they were planes were part of a global conspiracy. So this idea that somehow the facts can rule the day and that we can agree on the science, yeah, it would be nice. But when you consider the size of the audience we had on that all-night phone-in show, people now can basically develop their own set of facts. They can use the internet, they can use every tool available to them, they can find a set of facts that they want to believe in. They don't have to find the facts and then set their course of action after the fact. They can set their course of action first and then find the facts to fit it. And the comment about the campaign, I mean, I quite agree. If you're going to combat something like the argument over climate change, yes, facts are important. I'm not belittling facts, but you have to have a strategy, a coordinated strategy that is every bit as good and solid and directed, and includes a little bit of spin if necessary. Spin is not necessarily bad; it just means it's what you use to convince somebody of something. Framing is how you set the argument, and using that approach is more likely to win the day than to be a scientist being objective and say, here are the facts, I'm done. As I can tell you right now, the people who phoned in my all-night radio show, I would probably call them fringe, but they are never going to call themselves fringe. And the scientists would probably call me fringe, but I would never call myself fringe. Right? So it really depends on where you're sitting. So, when it comes to politics and science, you got to take a stand and you got to figure out how to promote your point of view.
Well, I'm just wondering, how many people, I realize that most people go to radio shows, but I often have people on the air that refuse to talk about politics. These are scientists who are afraid of losing their funding. They're afraid of being blacklisted by other scientists. They're afraid of what their family is going to say. So does that happen to anybody else?
I had kind of the opposite question of framing. Last week I was meeting with some staff in environmental education organization, and more than half their funding is congressional appropriation. And they were thinking about outreach, so they thought about maybe there's room for another block network focused on environmental education. And very quickly the problem became, we can't say anything too interesting because we've gotten calls from Congress, we've gotten calls from agency heads saying that crossed the line. And so one of the questions, or two questions I had kind of coming into this is, how could you set up a blog network to do these sort of the anti-framing, or how could you give guidelines to your bloggers so that you could be safe avoiding politics?
Well, I think one point to bring up, and Josh may be addressing this too, is not everybody necessarily has to do all tasks. But go on.
So, my question is actually related to that. So I work at the National Center for Science Education. This week we announced that we're getting into climate change the way we've been with evolution. So, and these are exactly the issues that we've been wrestling with, right? Especially, there's a lot of research that shows that when you go into, that a teacher who presents solutions alongside the science of climate change is going to reach students more effectively than if they just lay out the science and they just scare the hell out of kids, right? Because it's scary as hell, right? Like, the coastlines are going to flood and there are going to be earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes and, diseases and everything, right? And the crops will fail and the land will run with blood. So, and that turns kids off, understandably. So we know that if you present solutions alongside that it helps. But how do we recommend that teachers talk about those solutions without encouraging without being seen as partisans ourselves, or without making the teachers feel like they would be like their role would be politicized in doing that? And I think that that's sort of the parallel challenge to what we're talking about. Like, as journalists, how do you do that? How do you lay that out? Because at some point, it is true that science does not say we should do something about climate change, right? On its own, it doesn't say that.
but with fairly minimal assumptions, it does, right? Like, for any of the of effects that we're seeing now, you can get massive majority of people saying, yes, we should do something about that. We're seeing, whether it's crop failures or whether it's, we're talking about people who are seeing the hunting grounds where they like to go are changing, or any of these things. So sure, like, you can get that, but does that, can you say, therefore, as a matter of science, in a science class, yeah, let's talk about what we can do to fix this. Is that sufficient grounds? Or is that advocacy?
I'd just like to interject one minor point, which is that, yes, there is, to an extent, there are a spectrum of solutions to things, but a lot of people who oppose climate change oppose it because they don't want to come up with any solution whatsoever. And with evolution, there are no solutions involved, and people oppose it.
Yeah, sometimes people will use any objection. We have had some hands up. I would like to, we're getting a lot of really good questions. Are there people who have things that they have found work for them?
Sort of in response to this last comment and also on the framing, I think everyone on the solution end could stand and be a little more self-reflective, and maybe when you write about science, say where you're coming from, the context that you're in, just like you say where your funding source is from in your acknowledgments in a paper, that sort of thing. And that goes all the way to framing. I think a lot of these issues have been framed sort of haphazardly over the course of both political and scientific advances in the topic, and only after the fact then do people go and kind of construct how that narrative formed and how that frame actually came together into what we know it is today. Whereas if that happens earlier in the process, you can actually construct a frame that's maybe a little more helpful to getting solutions put out there in a way that doesn't scare your students and that sort of thing.
The solution that we use.
I got the mic.
So I was recently involved in some advocacy around not just the SOPA PIPA thing, which I just want to assume you guys know about, but also the Research Works Act, which is kind of the same sort of thing, but targeted towards academics, preventing public access mandates for taxpayer-funded research. And so what we did, I mean, I work for a private organization, and what we did to sort of craft our story and take part in it was to partner with organizations that are already explicitly advocacy organizations and provide them data, provide them information. And so we can go doing our thing and they can go and make better messages. And so it's kind of a nice partnership without us having to totally, change from being a private, for-profit business into an advocacy organization, but to work with them. So that's kind of the spectrum that we, of kinds of things you can do to be an advocate or to address a question without, having a radio show or something about it.
Jim Hutchins on 7 Synapses on Twitter, and first of all, thanks to the NCSE for taking this stand, because I'm a neuroscientist, I don't have a dog in the sun, but I really appreciate it as a scientist and as an American that you're taking
Okay,
this stand.
you just stop. Get your question.
But in answer to your question, what I found way back in the animal rights debates that we had some time ago is that if I adopted a position, I was genuinely interested in what other people had to say, even, I shouldn't say even students, but including students, and that I wanted to hear their position, and as long as it was well thought out, I just wanted people to keep an open mind in the sense of keep inquiring and keep thinking. And I'm enough of a scientist to believe that if people do that, that they'll eventually come around to the right answer, whatever that is. And as Woody Allen said, it's important to be genuine. If you can fake that, then you've really got it. And so your mileage may vary, but as we've talked about with other things, it has to be something where you can really adopt that attitude, where you can really feel it in your heart. But if you can come across, or if you can find the people who come across with a genuine sense of inquiry and, tell me more about that, then I think it really goes a long way. and puts people at ease and allows them to think the thoughts that they want to have. And sometimes, just sometimes, they can change their mind and come around to whatever the right point of view is.
And just to amplify that, the science that I deal with on my blog frequently has to do with gender equality and sexual violence. One of the things that I do when I'm working on these topics, some of the stuff that I write, I do actually keep it separate. Some of the stuff that I write is very polemical. Some of it is, it takes a specific argument or a specific set of data and pulls that all together into a piece that, whenever people are arguing about that sort of thing, can relate. And Pascal actually does something similar in her blog, but that's probably not what she's going to talk about.
Well, I was just going to bring out this, one of the older people at this event, that, you know, this chasm between, or this denying of science and politics didn't always happen. You even go back to the Reagan administration. There were scientific papers that came out that didn't fit with the politics, and the Reagan administration said, that's fine, that's what the science shows, but we don't believe that that's the way we should go. We're going to do something else because this is what we were elected to do. And somewhere along the line, politicians quit doing that and started attacking the science instead and trying to create this alternate reality. And I'm trying to figure out how the hell this happened.
Cigarettes.
Cigarettes.
It's a cigarette model applied to new things. And some of the same people doing it in the case of climate change. The same think tanks that develop the doubt is our product are involved in the climate, and they've set a model that anyone can follow. Naomi Oreskes has a book called Merchants of Doubt, which profiles these people.
John, if I may, in addition to that, I would just, I'm one of those older people in the room, I think. I'll show you my AAR people.
They keep sending me applications, and I keep saying no thank you.
There have been people who've denied science since Jenner invented vaccines, and there's two different kinds of denialism that you have to have on the table. One is out of tribal worldviews, and one is the selfish, on purpose obfuscation, like we have with climate change and cigarettes. The latter gets more attention because it's more heinous and immoral, and more overtly flying in the face of the evidence. But everybody in this room has opinions on things that we're not completely fully informed on, and the social science suggests that that comes from an awful lot of subconscious influence into the way we make decisions, one of which is we want our views to agree with those in the groups with whom we identify. It's called cultural cognition.
You missed the introduction, sorry.
Okay, so I'll shut up. but it's overly simplistic to say that it all comes from on purpose, selfish.
Oh yeah, I mean
most of it comes from who we are as human animals.
The anti-vaccine industry compared to the anti-climate change industry is trivial and fringe.
Fluoride. I mean, there have been tons of them that come from underlying cultural worldview stuff as opposed to the on-purpose evil.
I was just say, I think, this is way beyond my actual qualifications as a journalist, but I think just looking at the situation we're in with people not trusting science and not trusting journalists, the problem in the broadest context that we have right now is a trust issue. And that's an issue that framing and faking impartialness can't solve. In fact, those things do the exact opposite and put people more on their guard. And so in some ways, trying to drop that, and I think that the comments about just being genuine and being respectful, acknowledging that, we do have biases, but that we're willing to listen to each other and somehow trying to build that trust and those personal connections, I think, can be a much more powerful tool for then working on the science aspects of things, because that's where a lot of the resistance to new information is coming from a lack of trust, and there's no amount of framing that's going to reestablish trust for people.
Yeah, so I wanted to, I'm sorry, you name?
David, hi, I'm sorry. And forgive me if that was redundant to what I was too late to ever perhaps being late.
Okay. I wanted to get back on David's point really quickly. There's another source of kind of politicizing anti-science out there, and that is we work in marine fisheries and marine conservation, and this is not working.
Yeah.
And a lot of the viewpoints of the fishermen is not, that, there's a political slant to it or the scientists are coming after us. It's that we're the guys in the water every day. We know this ecosystem better than the scientists. We're the ones who should be managing it. And I think to get around that, you have to go out and work with them and respect their heritage and respect that they actually do know quite a bit about what they're doing. They're just coming from a slightly different view of how that works. And then working together so that they can see where your information is coming from. Then occasionally you can see where their information is coming from because sometimes they're right.
I don't need the mic. This is correctly. I just wanted to plug a thing that's coming out on Friday. Desiree has a podcast, especially speaking just to know those of you who didn't listen on Sunday. We should come out on Friday. The podcast is on politics and science. And Sean Otto and Chuck Kirschenbaum and I, we addressed the last 4 or 5 questions. So instead of addressing it myself, I'll just point you to the mic.
And we have not put together a wiki page for this session. That will be fixed.
Good.
It will. Yeah.
I'm Seth McGugan. I actually wrote a book about vaccines. Am I speaking?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And I think one thing that really interests me that I would like to get people's thoughts about are when it is appropriate to criticize people on the other side of whatever pro-science position you're taking. And I'll try and put that in a little bit of context. I found, at least when it comes to vaccines, I think that, is it David?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How's your kid, by the way?
What? Oh, good. She's good. She's better. I shouldn't say good. She's better. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we all know way too much about people we haven't met. It's typically when I start talking about vaccines and someone says, "How's your kid?" that's when I start getting nervous. But when it comes to this issue, I've found that engaging or criticizing people who are anti-vaccine activists is incredibly counterproductive, not only because it gets me embroiled in a whole mess of headache, but because it keeps me from reaching the people who I'm hoping to reach, which is the audience that hasn't made up their mind about the issue. And I know that it's obviously a little bit different with something like climate change, but I would just be curious to get people's thoughts about that. And the one other thing I want to say is, it still makes me very uncomfortable to position myself or think of myself as an advocate. And maybe that's also part of the reason why I try not to take on or engage directly with anti-vaccine advocates, because, and I'm not sure if that means I'm just fooling myself or, but I at least maintain the fiction in my own head that I'm only advocating for reality. I'm not advocating for a position in this debate.
To address criticizing people, there are a couple of things that I try to do. First off, there are 2 main reasons why we're criticizing somebody. We're criticizing them because they're wrong, and that I generally have no problem stating outright with backup. Try not to do it without that right there. But yeah, criticizing them because they're wrong is really very much criticizing their positions. I know that even within the anti-vaccine community, that doesn't always go over well, but I'm not sure there's any good way to get around that. The other thing that we criticize people for in these sorts of topics is their behavior. And as much as possible, I try to let that speak for itself. So If somebody is wrong and they have been told they're wrong, I might say, this person has said this. They said this before, and this was the response then. That's still true. I won't say, they're repeating things they know to be wrong. If they are particularly nasty people, I try to let their words speak for that and not do any characterizing of that. So I was going to say it feels like it's fair, but it isn't. But when it's their own behavior and their own words, I don't know how it can be much more fair. So it's one of those where I try to literally be as neutral as possible when I'm criticizing a person directly, but no problem.
I mean, because it's not. I don't think it's fair or unfair. It's more that I feel like I have a finite amount of time and resources, and I could write a story about a child who's infected with a vaccine-preventable disease, or I could write a story about a family that deliberately did not vaccinate their children. And for me, it's more effective, I think, to write about the family whose child was infected with a vaccine-preventable disease, because I'm not entering into this sort of direct combat.
Well, and that's also, I think, a difference between public figures and private figures. And I think it's another issue.
But I mean, even like, I don't write about Jenny McCarthy anymore just because I'm not sure it advances the story.
Do you mind if I come in just because it's on exactly this point? I was just going to say to this that one of the key things is to remember who your actual audience is at the end of the day. And very often when we're talking about scientific questions like this, we are never going to convince the cultural antis, the people who are culturally committed to being anti-vaccine or anti-climate change or whatever. They are not actually our target audience. Our target audience are the uncommitted who are in the middle. And I think by maintaining, first of all, the evidence base of science and remaining loyal to that and not exaggerating what the evidence shows, and secondly, as you were saying, Stephanie, by actually letting the outrageous antics of our opponents almost speak for themselves, I think by being reasonable, you actually stand a better chance of reaching those people in the middle who haven't actually made up their minds. And I think that's probably got to be the goal there.
Right. I'd like to jump in on this as well. One thing that's also important, I think, is the venue. You're absolutely right. You have to keep the audience in mind. But the venue, who's reading this? Online, we're always talking about how people are consistently, picking their filters. There's no general news sources people get. And people, to some extent, people are streaming are aligning according to their beliefs. So the people who are naturally going to be anti-vaccine are getting their information from, Dr. Marshallola or Andrew Weil, or these people who are peddling this stuff, and they're going to get there. So how do we break through those biases that people set up for themselves? Because a lot of it seems to me like it's circumstantial. Like if you're in a family where the people around you are not particularly science-minded, you're going to follow the people's advice who you trust. You're like, hey, Mom, what do you think about vaccines? And if your mom naturally is, following these, I say this because I have some family members who are like this, and they are extremely set in their ways and their beliefs, and they're not particularly scientific. And it just so happens that I also have other influences, so I've come to the scientific methods, but it always interests me, if you're in a community that's very isolated and you're getting your information from people you trust, and if those people aren't science-minded, why would you go to the enemy to get information? How do we break out of those tracks that people put themselves in? It's another thing to think about. It's really important.
Is this on? Hi, I'm Rob. I'm from the Department of Industry, Innovation, Science Research and Tertiary Education. in Australia. I do public awareness for enabled technologies, which is mostly nanotechnology. And I'm really glad to hear some of the things that he said today, because we deal with the Australian public, and we also do research in regards to their attitude, and we do find that there is the minority who is really for it, there is the minority who is dead set against it, and then there is the bulk of the public who are in the middle and not one way or the other, and that's who we communicate to, mostly in regards to nanotechnology, what it can do for you and what are the negatives, not how does it work, because that's not the thing that the non-science engaged public is interested in. We don't really engage with criticism unless it's directed at us, and we do occasionally get labelled as biased. We have to counter that. One of the things that we're doing this year, and it ties into your comment about how to get over the border of, the boundary of I'm not interested in science, why do I care about this apart from applications and how it can affect you, is we're working on critical thinking and arguments, how to make a good argument, and we're going right back to the basics. We've got some YouTube videos about logic, what is it, how do you apply it, and we've done it in a very fun kind of informational cartoon way. There's a 6-step process. It starts with logic, identifying false patterns, then the scientific process, the whole thing. So I just wanted to chuck in what we've been doing because I think it's really good to see how it kind of ties in what's being discussed in the room.
Just to echo that, people get information from their peers, and people trust their peers more than anybody else. And so one of the things that we've been doing, and Seth talks about finding the people in the middle, we organize trips, or what I do is I organize trips with mom bloggers to vaccine manufacturing facilities. And they meet the guys who invented this vaccine or that vaccine, and they talk about how they don't cause autism. And we do it in English, which is not always the easiest thing to do, especially in a pharmaceutical environment where there are legal restrictions to communication. But when you can get some prominent people from a different community, in this case moms, and we all know that moms make most of the healthcare decisions for their families, if you convince mom of this, then you can win over that middle. And so we bring relatively prominent moms in to meet with these folks, and we train these folks, and we tell them how this is what mom cares about. And we give them bios and backgrounds and things like that. So they're ready, they know who they are when they come in. And it takes a long time. The trips are almost a year in the making because there's high risk. But the payoff is enormous. And these are moms. People think, mommy blogger, who's a mommy blogger? Well, mom bloggers talk to millions of people each day. I mean, one of the people who came on our trip has an audience of 5 million people a month. And so, and she's influential. And when she says, I went to this and it was amazing and I totally buy into this now, that has a real impact. And we've done this for 3 years.
So who are the mavens for climate change, for evolution, general science literacy?
Well, you find bridge figures. You find bridge figures. What I do is I try to find moms who are scientists. And on the vaccine issue, I try to find moms. And then to buy credibility, it's not it's a mercenary term, but I find moms who are scientists because they speak both languages. I have kids too. In environmental, on the issue of climate change, it's a harder sell, right? Because, who's there? But if you have environmentalists who are stockbrokers, now you've got, there are people who look at, right, there's 3 people. But if you find those bridge figures, you have a way to reach into those new communities and build influence there.
I would say 2 prominent climatologists, Richard Alley and Terry Emanuel, are registered Republicans and have tried to reach out to their own party. There's somebody who's in the news, Catherine Cato, I think is the name. She's down in Texas. Her husband's the evangelical minister. She's traveling to churches. She's a climatologist. So there are people out there within the scientific community who are, by the nature of this issue, bridge figures they can identify through doing what they can. The insurance industry totally research. Yeah.
There's an entire organization of evangelical environmentalists.
Yeah, I know that with the evangelical community there's big environmental projects.
Yeah, since my dark history as a journalist, and now I work as a director of communications for a nonprofit genetics funding agency. So in terms of kind of some of the successes, and we go back to the earlier comment about the cultural cognition, we actually have taken that idea of cultural cognition and I think put it into practice. We work with our community, with our funders, with the academics, with the politicians, because we're heavily funded at a couple of levels of government, and try to get it to the point where the cultural cost of funding us and agreeing with us, because we're heavily involved in agricultural biotech, which can be a minefield, and we've tried to get that cultural cost so low, or the cultural risk, I guess, that they don't see a problem. They look at us and say, okay, we get that, we understand. We don't see a risk, we don't see a downside. I mean, we use all the modern campaign tactics. We have a paid lobbyist, that we have on retainer. It costs us $4,000 a month to have them around as a lobbyist for us, which isn't huge, but when you're a nonprofit with a total budget for everything we do, not much more than that sometimes. That is a significant cost for us. But we approach it from that point of view. How can we reduce the cultural risk to everybody around us? Our stakeholders, our funders, our public, our media. How can we reduce that and use all the modern techniques, all the modern tools? We have our own news aggregator that we use. And we aggregate news around genetics from both sides, if you want to call it one side or the other, but from all points of view. It's not just pro-ag biotech. We would rather people engage in the discussion about the evils of GMO with us than do it up there, in Twitter between each other. We would rather be part of that discussion. We would rather the politicians come to our office and say, well, we don't agree with you. We would rather have that discussion with them in our office than have them, debated in the legislature up in Canada. So we kind of work that way. For the most part, it's fairly successful. We're not the biggest organization in the country. We're not the smallest. We're not in danger of folding, even in a recession. We've got about a $65 million science competition coming up. So, it works for us. It does put us at the top of the heap. We're far from the bottom. And it is using the whole idea of the cultural differences and how can we work with politicians and public perceptions to make it all work.
At the same time, I'd like to add a little bit of caution, which I have to do as I'm sitting here watching Josh and Ryan. Those are not necessarily the people you need to reach in the middle are not necessarily going to be the people who you can move to quick action if you need quick action for something. They are not necessarily the people you can get to call a congressperson on a dime. So there is also a role for the, let's call them more heavily committed, that should be considered at the same time.
Then it's also an element of patience. We started this process in 2006, right? When the organization was first founded. I came on board about 4 years ago. So this process has been ongoing for 4 or 5 years, and it's only now that we're really seeing the success. There has been no overnight. There's nobody 6 years ago we could call it quick action. However, because we've been working on this for so long, there is now. When there was a new premier elected in our province, we were already there. We already had all the contacts, we already had everything we need. There was we never missed a beat. We just moved on, and we're able to get action fairly quickly on the front. So patience is as much part of it as finding a single influencer who can push hard.
Okay. Other thoughts as we head toward the end of the session?
Sure.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up, first of all, to say that the guy at the back who was talking about the taking non-bloggers to the vaccine factory is one of the best initiatives of this sort that I've heard about for ages. I think it's absolutely terrific. But I think in similar vein to that, picking up, I think, on what you were saying over there and so on, I think every people like us need to be less embarrassed about taking up issues like this with family and friends and challenging things on a really small scale level. I'm sure a lot of us do that anyway, but actually I think everybody who's got an affinity for science needs to do that, and it's often difficult to do. I mean, just an example, so for myself, we recently had a baby, and in the UK we have this National Childbirth Trust who do kind of antenatal classes and so on. And quite a lot of the people in those classes are, quite a lot of people who run those classes are very often very pro-alternative medicine, trying to get you to use homeopathic remedies and all that kind of thing. I was in there with a scientist friend of mine who I know very well. Both of us were kind of itching to say something, and we didn't because it was too embarrassing to do so. And actually I really regret that, because in fact having a couple of people who really do know about that kind of thing, who were in that class, kind of countering that misinformation, could actually have been really, really helpful. And I think the more that people do that, and I'm the first to admit I'm not very good at it necessarily always in a private sphere, because it is embarrassing, and if people are kind of going on about things that are transparently wrong at a dinner party, it is, I mean, sometimes we do have to challenge these things, because otherwise they can become public memes much more easily.
And that's really hard to do when you're sitting there in a specific face-to-face confrontational venue. But at the same time, this is why I'm never going to leave Facebook unless they make it absolutely impossible. I have lots of real-life friends on there. There's family on there. There are people who believe in everything on there, who see my feed, who see what I put out there. They see when the New York Times reports on yoga injuries, and I post that on my wall because there are people out there who think that yoga is the cure-all. It's not just a kind of exercise. So you can do that sometimes in venues where it's a little more passive. You don't have to directly confront people, but they are still, they're already friends with you. They already have an attachment with you. They already identify with you culturally somehow. And you can put that information out there. Let them take it or not. They probably won't the first 24 times, but eventually some of that may seep through.
Thanks, I'm Rich. Another great venue for that, I think, which may be hard or maybe easy, is airplanes are a great place because you know you're never going to see the person. I'm not lying, because a couple weeks ago I was on a plane and I had this conversation with a guy, and I had the hardest time in the world convincing him that wind turbines were actually generating power. They weren't powered by electricity. He thought that the windmills were turning because we were putting electricity into them, so we were wasting energy to make wind turbines. And I spent a really long time trying to, in an effort to convince him otherwise, to talk about the actual physics behind how wind turbines work and how the same reason in parts of the airplanes flying. I was going to see. But at the end, the same thing was he was a local state representative in my state, and so after having that conversation with him, I was actually very happy to have had it, and made a small effort, because you never know, what's going to happen. Who you're sitting next to at the same time, you never really can see them. So you can take risks in ways that you don't, your mom's not going to take risks.
How do you explain visuals that are more than 100 years old?
That is actually true. I know of a couple examples off the top of my head where people would put up windmills as a PR thing and end up using power to power them so they look like they are moving when they actually aren't.
I was going to forget we heard
And actually, on that note, if you have some expertise, don't be afraid to contact your local people. I have a friend who is now Al Franken's go-to person on IT questions, just because he happened to speak up on an issue and have a background that couldn't be denied.
I wanted to just to sort of go a little bit further on what Mark said, and actually what you said earlier too about should we only be trying to convince the undecided? Should we not waste time on the folks who are really committed to an issue that we, on the opposite side? I think that if all we're trying to do is convince the folks in the middle, and there aren't that many of them on a lot of issues, then what are we doing? It might be really tough to change people's minds, the real folks who are dug in, but I think we have to try and do it flat out with your more recent comment, person to person. Don't be afraid to be an asshole every now and then, I guess. Says thumbs up, okay.
Unless you're stuck in the middle seat.
If you let some comment pass, people are going to go through life thinking that they're right, and there's no other way of looking at it. So you've got to speak up sometimes.
I think
it's
a difference between different forms. I'm William Gunn from Mendeley, just so that in case anybody doesn't know. And I totally disagree with you on the statement that there are issues out there where there's very few in the middle ground. In fact, I think for most issues, even the ones that only the controversy gets reported, the middle ground is actually huge. In most cases, the middle ground is the by population vastly the biggest, because a lot of people just want to get on with their life. They want to go to work, hang out with their family, those sort of things. And politics might be 1% or 5% of their life, right? And so I challenge you to find one issue on which everyone has a very polarized stand.
I think you can find half a dozen issues where the middle ground is actually the smallest proportion.
Such as?
Religion, climate change.
Climate change, 17% denial. About 50 to 60%. Most polls show 50 to 60% are undecided or slow.
It depends how you phrase the question. I can look at numbers that show it's about 15% who don't have any opinion. So, I mean, polls are minefield, of course, but I think religion's another great issue. I mean, we've had atheists talking for 300 years about in the Western world, and hasn't really changed a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, but those people are in the middle ground there too, right? There's atheists are in the minority, and then there's a whole lot of people who have strong beliefs, but they're not out there, being evangelical about them. So if you view it as atheists versus evangelicals, then that is not the majority of the population there, right?
I think again, it's a matter of definition.
Do you want to wrap up?
Can I have?
Yeah.
We've got 1 minute.
Yeah. I just want to plug something. April 23rd, 24th at University of Wisconsin-Madison, we're having a conference, Science Writing in the Age of Denial, that is dead on this topic. A couple days with Naomi Oreskes and some really great speakers. And if you want to take a few months to ruminate, show up in Madison, we'll start all over.
Thank you very much.
That seems like a reasonably good way to wrap.
It does. And thank you all for coming and contributing.